we can learn from how Romans of Cato's time dealt with these issues. And I want to caveat by saying that Cato and Caesar and other figures from that time do not track directly onto American politics. But we think we can learn a lot from the way they lived their lives and from the general principles they applied in the way they lived their lives. So Cato really comes to the fore in Roman politics at a time when the Republic, as we know it, and the Republic that had essentially become the hegemon in the Mediterranean world, was breaking down from the inside out. It was a time of tremendous upheaval and change. It was a time of cultural change. Because of the Roman Republic's conquests, a lot of culture and a lot of wealth was filtering into Rome and changing the society that had been stable and fundamentally conservative for centuries. Cato dealt with this essentially by presenting himself as someone out of the Roman past, someone who incarnated the founding virtues that made the Roman Republic what it was. So that was one major change. Another major change was the beginning of factionalism in Roman politics. Roman politics had always been tumultuous. There had always been very overt class conflict. There had always been resistance between the plebeians and the patricians. But what happens in Cato's time is that we see the first political factions. These are not really political parties in our sense. They didn't have organizations or headquarters or party platforms. The people that led these factions were from the same social strata. They were the elite of Rome. They were all slave owners. They were all from the wealthiest segment of the Roman population, but they had different constituencies and different agendas and oftentimes different marriage and family alliances. The faction that Cato became the leader of and Cato became the public face of was called the optimates. This is one thing that the Romans did that we still do. They have very self-flattering party names. The optimates meant the best men. And I'm not sure who came up with that name, but it was a very good piece of PR. The point at which Cato rises to become the public face of the optimates is really the crisis over Catalan's conspiracy. Catalan was a radical populist who gained a lot of public support on a platform of abolishing debts on a very populist economic platform. But he also had plans to essentially stage a terrorist campaign against the Roman Senate that would end up capturing and killing much of the Roman Senate, would even ally with some of Rome's foreign enemies. So Cato, who had at this point developed a reputation as a Stoic and as a model of the virtuous Roman past, comes to the fore during Catalan's conspiracy by successfully arguing against a young Julius Caesar. The issue is whether the people who've been captured in this conspiracy should be executed without a trial on grounds of national security, or whether they should be given a trial. Julius Caesar succeeds in persuading the Senate that precedent demands that the Roman way is to give these people a trial. But Cato, after Caesar had swung the Senate to his side, delivers the most forceful speech of his life, essentially arguing against what he considers a moral decline of the Roman Republic that leads to Caesar's position. He's able to sway the entire Senate back over to his side for immediate execution. And at this point, Caesar, when he has lost the debate, storms out of the Senate, tries to disrupt the proceedings, fails, which leads to the execution of the conspirators, but more importantly for our purposes, leads to the lifelong enmity of Cato and Julius Caesar. The historian Sallust, who was a partisan of Julius Caesar, who was one of Julius Caesar's biggest fans, still could not keep himself from admiring Cato. He said that while Caesar grew famous and popular and powerful through his generosity, Cato grew famous and popular and powerful through the integrity of his life. Cato was a man who lived his principles. He was one of the most principled, most uncompromising politicians that we know of in Roman history or of any other history. And that's one of the things that attracts us to Cato. Even though he probably wouldn't have agreed with us, we wouldn't have agreed with him, his priorities might not have tracked on to 21st century America, but we can admire the way that he lived out the principles he stood for. But there are also consequences to this. When we talk about the Triumvirate, which is essentially the alliance of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, who were two of Rome's most ambitious generals and Rome's richest man, an alliance to essentially put control of the Republic in the hands of free men. Well, what did these three guys have in common? They really hated each other. But what they had in common was that each of them had been individually alienated by Cato. Cato had used his mastery of the Senate and mastery of Roman politics to stymie their personal ambitions one by one by one, until they realized that the only way to overcome this force was to team up. So Cato's principle both made him an incredibly inspiring, personally magnetic leader in his times, but it also created an enormous opposition to Cato that leads in many ways to the death of the Republic. Another factor in Cato's life is that while he establishes an incredible example by the way he conducts his life, there are also times in which he runs away from power. When Cato ran for consul, which is the highest office in the Roman Republic, in an attempt to oppose Julius Caesar, Cato essentially refuses to talk about anything but Caesar, which he thinks is the most important item on the agenda. And yet the Roman people don't want to hear about this. They want Cato to distribute bribes, like other Roman politicians did. They wanted to hear about his war record. They wanted Cato to go around with an entourage and pretend like he knew people that he didn't even know, which was what politicians do today and what politicians did then. But Cato was having none of that. He said that someone like me would not change his manners to please anyone. And if I lost, well, that's just fair. Unfortunately, because Cato has this habit of running away from power when, by his own terms and his own understanding of liberty in the Republic, it could do the most good, this essentially damages the Republic's cause. And the point at which civil war becomes inevitable is the point at which Pompey and Caesar, who were members of the Triumvirate and then develop a rivalry that turns into war. Just before that war, they were trying to negotiate and attempt a face-saving compromise that would result in Caesar getting out of the way province and being able to keep his army without actually crossing the Rubicon and invading what is considered Roman territory. When this face-saving compromise is on the table, Cato insists to Pompey, Cato was in the room at the time because he's one of the most trusted members of the Senate, Cato insists to Pompey, you're being deceived, you're being a fool, don't listen to Caesar. Pompey listens to Cato instead of to Caesar, and the civil war is what transpires, and the fall of the Republic to Caesar is what transpires. So we think this story is both about the benefits and about the pitfalls of living a life of incredible, almost superhuman integrity like Cato did. And of course, Cato ended his life in much the same way as he lived it. When the forces of Pompey, what was left of the forces of Pompey, fled to Africa after Caesar's great victory at the Battle of Pharsalus, Cato was left essentially alone, without very many allies, without very many troops to resist Caesar's advance. Caesar would have offered Cato a pardon. Cato would have been able to live on in the Senate. He could have been the face of the opposition for the rest of his life. He could have been what we call a tolerated crank. He could have stood up and given these stem whiners against Caesar for the rest of his life, and Caesar would not have minded because it would have made Caesar look very moderate. But Cato says, Caesar's a tyrant. Tyrants do not have the legitimate authority to pardon. Caesar cannot pardon me. I would rather take my own life and make a stand about the importance of the Republic as it existed than accept Caesar's pardon. So what Cato does is he takes the book Phaedo by Plato, which is essentially the story of Socrates' own suicide by drinking hemlock. Cato calls for it very publicly. He reads it over twice. He dismisses everyone from the room. He calls for his sword, and then he stabs himself in the guts. And then the thing that really puts Cato over the top in terms of historic resonance and the way his suicide is lived on, in fact, you see it on the cover of our book. There are a few books that have spoiler alerts right on the cover, but this is how the story ends. At the point that Cato had stabbed himself in the guts, it was not a fatal wound because he had broken his hand punching someone in the face. He was that kind of guy. It was not a fatal wound. Surgeons were called in to stitch Cato up and to save his life. Cato comes to and has the presence of mind to rip open his wound. I know. To rip open his wound and cement his death, but also cementing his legacy as someone who was so principled that even when it led to his death, he would follow those principles all the way into suicide. After his death, Cato is turned into a political symbol of all sorts of causes he might not have identified with. The first presentation of Cato after his death is by Julius Caesar, who paints a billboard of Cato ripping himself open and has it paraded through the forum as part of his triumph. This was supposed to be a great moment for Caesar, but amazingly, as people saw this billboard going by, they started booing and hissing and groaning because Cato had become a martyr, even for people that didn't agree with him. He had somehow transcended the politics that he was a part of.